I will begin by acknowledging the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, who are the traditional owners of the land on which I am meeting you on today. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and future. So my name is Karina, and I'm from the Relationships and Sexuality Education Project. For those of you who haven't worked with us before, we provide support for Devway school staff in delivering comprehensive and evidence-based relationships and sexuality education. We are generously supported by the WA Health Growing and Developing Healthy Relationships program at Curtin University, and they helped us make this webinar possible today. We also run a few professional development events throughout the year, which you can find on our Eventbrite and on our website. So before we start, I must let you know we are recording and the video will be published on the RSC Project YouTube, which you will receive a copy of, or rather we will send you the link to watch. So for the next hour and a half, we will be talking about protective behaviours in the school settings with Jodie from PB West. Protective behaviours is a strategy that builds capacity, develops assertiveness, self-esteem, resilience and communication skills. PB West teaches strategies to help prevent abuse, reduce violence and encourage adventurous, fulfilling lives. The team at PB West have over 20 years experience in teaching protective behaviours in Australia and abroad. So Jodie will present for about an hour and afterward there will be time for questions and answers and some discussion. So feel free to use the chat throughout the session. Please join me in welcoming Jodie from PB West. Thank you.
Are we on? Can you hear me? Okay. Hello, everybody. My name is Jodie Ferguson. I'm the director at PB West. I've been working in protective behaviours for quite some time. And today we're going to talk a little bit about protective behaviours in the school setting. So I think everybody can see the screen. Is that correct? Yeah, awesome. It's just a brief information session. It's for about an hour, probably a bit longer, depending on how we go. And I know that Karina just did an acknowledgement of country, but we would like to do so as well, to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land in which we are today, which is the Whadjuk Balladong people, and we thank them, their ancestors, and the generations to come for looking after and being the caretakers of this land. So when I was first asked by Karina to come and do a presentation, I thought, what are we going to talk about in an hour? There is so much to talk about in regards to PBs. So I thought I would start first with telling you about us, just a little bit about our values and how we work. So we work from a strengths-based perspective here at PB West, and all of protective behaviours is strengths-based and is empowered. So we believe in investing in the social capability and empowering everyone to help keep children and young people safe and to become lifelong and adventurous learners. So our practice is grounded in upholding and respecting and advocating and role modelling our responsibility for human rights, particularly the rights of the child. So we do that in our belief that everybody has or can have, or everybody has the right to feel safe. And our goal is to empower everyone, particularly vulnerable people, with skills and knowledge of their rights and to self-determination. And we strive for in our training for everybody to actualise that protective behaviours has unlimited applications, which I hope that we will be able to expand on during this presentation. So one of the questions we often get asked is, what is protective behaviours? So protective behaviours is actually, it's really practical, it's a down-to-earth approach, it's a life skill, and what it does is it encourages self-empowerment and self-determination. So that's the empathy, connection and responsibility for ourselves, and responsibility to other people is a key component of protective behaviours. And when we teach and role model protective behaviours, what we're doing is we're facilitating learning opportunities, and through every interaction that's going to enable every person that we interact with to realise their own right to feel safe at all times. So, and that's because protective behaviours has two themes. So you've probably seen these before. So the first theme is that we all have the right to feel safe all of the time. And the second theme is that we can talk with someone about anything. It used to be once upon a time that we can talk with someone about anything, no matter what it is. It used to be that we can talk with someone about anything, even if it's awful or small. But what we know in protective behaviours and what we know in working with people, that unless we actually can talk with people about the good stuff and share the everyday stuff, it's actually really hard for us to talk about the stuff that's might be troubling or worrisome or concerning in a particular way. So that's theme 2, but theme 1 is the one that we're going to focus on mostly today, is that we all have the right to feel safe all the time. And this is important because if we're just talking that we all have the right to feel safe and we have the words, but we're not working congruently with the belief that everybody has the right to feel safe all of the time, then what comes across is not as authentic as it should be, and it doesn't actually facilitate those feelings of safeness. And we'll go into a little bit more about that, but first of all, I'm just going to show you what is actually involved when we do our PB training. So when we talk about becoming a practitioner or somebody that can actually practice PBs in every essence of the word, in being a PB practitioner and feel safe teaching it, they've actually learned all of these things that you can see on the slide. And the first part of that is the language of safety, unwritten rules and feelings, thoughts and behaviours. So we call this the social and emotional framework of PBs. The social and emotional framework actually provides us with the tools that we need to be able to operate or to be able to teach in a process that's congruent with the theme that we all have the right to feel safe all of the time. So if we're talking to our young people or talking with and interacting in a way where they may not feel safe with us, it really doesn't matter what lesson plan we're putting in front of them, because we're not actually being congruent. And that comes back to theme 2, which brings us to theme 1, sorry, we all have the right to feel safe. And theme 2, we can talk with someone about anything. Sorry, I'm not sure what's happened to my video there for a minute. I'm just going to change that and see. Sorry, I just got lost for a second. When PBs was first introduced, when PBs was first developed, I don't know if we're all on the same page. When PBs was first developed, it was developed by Peg Flandry West, and it was developed to work in these particular areas. So that was to work with children and young people that were experiencing sexual abuse, that were experiencing lateral violence, that were experiencing maybe high degrees of poverty, food insecurity, homelessness, whether they came from single parent families, whether there was a lot of grief and sorrow in their world, from families and places where there was a lot of mental health conditions, where there may have been high incarceration rates, chronic illness, crime and domestic violence. So PBs, when it first started, was developed to find a way for young people that might be experiencing any of these things to feel safe in their life, even if all of this was happening. When it was brought into Australia, it was brought over particularly to work in child sexual abuse prevention. And all the other aspects of PBs, or where PBs worked or was able to help people to feel safe, sort of got sidetracked, I suppose, or lost a little bit along the way. And what we're hoping, or what we try to do, is to allow people to see how PBs as an empowerment process actually helps facilitate safety in all aspects of a young person's life, not just in child sexual abuse prevention or not just in healthy relationships. So it actually can do a whole lot of things. It's an empowerment process. These things that we're looking at here, that Peg Flandry West, who started PBs, who developed it, we might call them today, if I can get my slide, let me take 5 minutes. We might call them today the ACEs. Or if you're working with Aboriginal children and young people working in Aboriginal health, you might also call them social determinants of health. So we know that ACEs have a strong impact on a child's ability to grow into having functional, healthy relationships later on in life. And if we can work from the PB's perspective, which is the process that everybody has the right to feel safe all the time, and everything we're doing is about a person's right to feel safe all of the time, then we can help to eliminate some of these long-term effects of ACEs. And we do that, let me just gather my thoughts, we do that by actually working from the social and emotional framework. And this is important for us as educators because we're working in those 3 strategies of prevention. So the first one that we work at is we work in a primary prevention, which is, you know, I've got to get to the wrong slide, which is of course the elimination of abuse. And that's around, you know, being able to work straight in, being able to see what's happening, and early intervention, which is our secondary. So primary prevention is, let me get back to it. Sorry, I'm a little bit flustered. We're looking at the elimination of all abuse and being to work at that pointy end. In secondary, we're looking at early intervention. And this is really a place where our educators do a lot of work, because oftentimes our educators are working frontline and they're creating those relationships with young people through connection and empathy, which would be called the social determinants of health, where we can really work to eliminate ongoing abuse because we're developing those long-term relationships. And also we work from a tertiary intervention as well. So we care to reduce the effects and reduce the risk of reoccurrence later on. So as a protective factor in a young person's life, which all educators, you know, child health nurses or any professional that's involved in a young person's life has the potential to be a protective factor. We really need to know what it is that how we're working within those primary, secondary and tertiary intervention spaces. And that's really why we teach and role model PBs. So when we're teaching and role modelling PBs, what we're doing is we're helping to protect children and young people, really because we can't be with them every minute of the day. And we're, sorry, excuse me. We're actually opening up those conversations that give permission or allow children to talk about things that they normally wouldn't talk about, or stuff that might be very difficult for them to disclose, or maybe that they've never had the words or been given the strategies to have those conversations. And when we're working from a perspective that we all have the right to feel safe all of the time, and that is the number one, not only the number one theme, but the number one trauma-informed practice or process from which we operate as practitioners. Children feel safe enough to learn, they feel safe enough to discuss, and they feel safe enough to reach out to those people in their lives that are protective factors. The other reason that we teach and role model PBs is because it helps us to actually, it provides a safe way for talking about all sorts of abuse, whether it's domestic violence, it's bullying, it's emotional violence, it's gender-based violence, or it's child sexual abuse. So we're using strategies that can be one step removed and that allow a child the freedom to talk about these things, and gives us the process or the way to talk to children about all forms of abuse while everybody can feel safe at the same time. It also helps everybody to be aware of the risks that are surrounding in the day-to-day lives of our children. And many members of the community who work with families and children find that training protective behaviours is a valuable resource, because what they can do is it actually gives them strategies and the words and the opportunity to be able to talk with everyone about anything, no matter what it is. Oh, I didn't realise I could do it that way. So when we use PBs in the classroom, what we're doing is we're using a process that can help grow confidence and self-esteem of our young people. And we do that because as a practitioner of PBs or someone that's following the PB process when they teach PBs, they're actually seeing, hearing, listening and spending time with the and hearing what children have to say. And that's really essential because a lot of children, especially children that may have experienced some form of abuse of any kind, or children that have experienced any form of trauma, often feel invisible, that nobody's seeing them, nobody's relating to them, nobody knows what's happening to them. It can be really isolating and they can feel quite alone. PBs also encourages independence, and it does that because what we're doing when we're teaching the strategies of PBs to children and young people is we're giving them life skills. We're actually teaching them ways to problem solve. We're teaching them ways to find to recognise when they might feel unsafe. We're giving them strategies about what they can do if they might feel unsafe. And we do this from a one-step removed process because we want to remove all blame, blame, guilt, shame, fear, or any of those triggers that children and young people might find traumatizing. So we use the one-step remove process to do that. And it also builds resilience. So when we talk to children and young people about feeling safe or their early warning signs or not understanding whether are on that safety continuum, which is safe, fun to feel scared, risking on purpose, or totally unsafe, and we give them things like the safety sum, whether someone might have choice, control, or time limit in their early warning signs, as to figure out where they are on that safety continuum. That's a huge life skill, and it helps them to build resilience because we will have conversations with children and young people like, well, what could somebody do to help themselves feel safe, even if, well, what if someone was experiencing their early warning signs and didn't want to do something, then what could somebody do? We can actually really do this from some fun activities, and we throw in some fun scenarios with the little bit tougher scenarios when we work with young kids. For example, what might somebody do to help themselves feel safe if they're asked to brush the teeth of a crocodile? What might somebody do to help themselves feel safe if they have to put eye drops in a giraffe? And then what might somebody do to help themselves feel safe if they didn't have the house key to get in, the key to get into the house when they got home from school? And then to what might somebody do to help themselves feel safe if somebody tried to wanted to look at their private parts or touch their private parts, or what might somebody do if they were going to help themselves feel safe if somebody was too close in their personal space and they didn't feel okay with that. So we sort of use this one step removed and these problem solving strategies to help children and young people feel safe. So the other point that it does, I'm talking too much, I know, is it helps to develop some self-respect. Because once children realise that they actually have the right to feel safe, and it becomes firm belief within themselves, and that there are strategies that they can do to help themselves feel safe. So it's not only that they have the right to feel safe, but they have some strategies in place to help them feel safe. They develop more self-esteem, self-worth, and of course that goes with self-respect. So one of the things about PBs, and when we talk about rights and responsibilities, is that we have a responsibility for ourselves and a responsibility to other people. So this means that it actually helps them to develop respect for others. So when I recognise that I have, if I was using myself as an example, that I have the right to feel safe and every person has the right to feel safe, then my responsibility for myself is to ensure that I am feeling safe. But my responsibility to other people is to ensure that their right to feel safe is also upheld. And therefore, my responsibility for myself in that is to change my behaviour or to ensure that my behaviour is congruent with understanding that everybody has the right to feel safe. it also makes them better learners, because PBs really is such a trauma-informed practice. Then we want people to feel safe all of the time, so we're not triggering people, and their brains are more open to that prefrontal cortex, where they're open to learning, experiencing new things, knowing that they can do so in feelings of safeness. Where if somebody's not feeling safe and the back brain has taken over, then the ability to learn new things is really hindered by those triggers and those traumas that might be ongoing. And finally, empowered children don't make ideal victims. And particularly when we're looking from child sexual abuse prevention strategies, we realise, that there are certain qualities, or certain, that's the wrong word, qualities, but there are certain elements that a perpetrator of child sexual abuse might look for in victim selection. And one of those is to be disempowered and not know enough about body boundaries, not to know enough about their rights to feel safe, and not having those network people, and not having supports within their lives where they know that they can go to for help. So when we're empowered children, so when we're helping them on their way to self-empowerment, we know that with every step that we take, we're actually one step away from, we're helping them grow and less likely to be victimised. So there are some apprehensions that often teachers and people that are asked to teach PBs often come to us and ask us lots of questions. And there are some apprehensions around that sometimes get overlooked when there's just a lesson plan that people are asked to deliver, particularly in the classroom space. So the first one is that sometimes there can be incongruency. So, and by this I mean, if we as a teacher don't actually understand the process of protective behaviours and the trauma-informed process behind it, and therefore which influences our way of interaction, then when we're teaching about early warning signs, the right to feel safe, that we can talk with someone about anything, if we don't actually practice that, if our children don't actually feel that in the classroom, then there isn't a lot of congruency, so it makes it a little less authentic. Sometimes the teacher or an instructor confidence regarding PB process can be problematic. Sometimes sometimes teachers ring and say, well, I don't feel confident in delivering this PB program. What if? So what if a child says this? What if this comes out? It's not always a scripted conversation, and there isn't always an absolute answer. You don't know always what's going to come into the conversation when teachers are talking or teaching a PB lesson in the classroom. And this can be difficult, particularly if you don't understand the process of PBs and you can't fall back on the process to lead through those conversations in the classroom that are going to facilitate safeness for everybody within that space. One of the other apprehensions that some teachers have is that it can actually be triggering. It can be, when we look at the stats around all sorts of abuse, whether it's emotional, psychological, physical, sexual abuse, we know that women are highly represented in that area, and women are also highly represented in the care and the teaching professions. So there can be actual personal triggers for teachers or people that are wanting to teach PBs in their classroom. And on top of that, there can be apprehensions around whether or not something I'm going to say is going to trigger someone or a child in my classroom, and if so, how do I manage that in a classroom setting? So without having the process of PBs in place, that can be quite triggering. Another apprehension around PBs is particularly oftentimes parents think, well, we can just teach this PB program and my children are okay. what it is that when we use it as just a one-off lesson plan and not something that's continual throughout a child's life and a child's well-being, personal safety is an ongoing concern. It's not just something we can talk about once. And oftentimes, if it's being carried out in the school and delivered as a lesson, then the broader community might think, well, I don't have to worry about that too much, and that's the sole responsibility that a teacher might feel that they're responsible for that child's personal safety, and that can be a huge apprehension and a huge worry for some. And I think some of the ways around that is by building up that community of practitioners and that community knowledge of the processes and how to interact with protective behaviours, both in the larger environment in which a child lives, including families, communities, and the rest of it. Sometimes there can be an expectation that children can stop, once they've been taught PBs, that they can stop abuse from occurring. And sometimes the effects of those expectations can be really harsh, particularly on a young child or somebody that may have been experienced trauma or abuse in some way. And there can be a lot of, well, you should have, I should have told somebody, I didn't know, So now we've got guilt and we've got shame and we've got some of those other compounding issues that can occur if we think that children are responsible for keeping themselves safe. So keeping children safe and teaching them PBs is one aspect of keeping children safe and keeping children feeling safe. The other aspect is knowing what to look for in the wider community, and us as educators, trainers, practitioners, social workers, our responsibility is to also look at what's happening in the child's environment and to know everything that's, and to be aware, we can't know everything, but to be aware of the indicators and signs of all forms of abuse and neglect. So one of the other, and then the final apprehension that I've come across is that oftentimes educators feel that there isn't enough accessible support for them to run or to run the lesson within their classroom, or to have enough knowledge, or sometimes even there's an overwhelming amount of literature and they don't really know where to start from it. So it's about having that point of contact and just being able to have those support networks in place. And you can actually get those through becoming a practitioner and being a part of a practitioner network, which is really good. The other aspect is that sometimes when we teach these things, or we're teaching it to children as a lesson plan, they may not disclose there and then to a teacher, but it may be triggering for them. So what is the ongoing support that is available for a child after we have these lesson plans? So making sure that there's somebody in the school that they can talk with, that they know who the networks and who the support people are. So that can be really important, which is also why it's important to involve the families and the communities in understanding what protective behaviours is and how well it works. So in saying all of that, I'll just have a breather. It can be a little bit scary if we look at all of those things, and it shouldn't be. So PBs is an empowerment process, and if we understand the process of PBs, we can feel safe having any of those conversations with children and young people and parents and anybody that we come across, because there has been a lot of fear around protective behaviours and teaching protective behaviours and being involved in protective behaviours, that I think that's where a lot of that apprehension that we were talking about earlier comes from. But as Peg Flandry-West, the developer of PBs, said, we can't be scared into feeling safe. And in essence, what that means is that we feel safe by becoming self-empowered and self-determined, and knowing that we have choices, strategies and skills in which to build our practice on. And that's the same for us as educators. It's just as important for us as educators, if not more, just the same amount of importance as it is for the children and young people in which we're teaching this to. So we can't be scared about teaching or bringing PBs to the forefront, because that's not going to help ourselves to feel safe, and it's not going to help our children and young people to feel safe either. Does that make sense? Yeah, I know I can't see anybody, but hello. So I suppose safety is more, as people say, safety is more than just the absence of risk or the absence of fear. Safety is about having that inner knowledge that I know how, when I understand what's happening in my body, that I know when I'm feeling safe and unsafe, and I know what I can do about it. All right. So I don't know how we're going for time, but we'll just keep going. I've probably got way too much here. So how do we teach protective behaviours? So there's actually two parts to that. And I thought about this a lot, and I've written a couple of books on it. But the first thing that I wanted to say is that when we teach protective behaviours, we sort of want to educate people. So educate and awareness is the first thing that we all do as part of, as being a capacity builder and wanting to create change. We go to that education and awareness. And the most important part of that is that it's consistent. You know, that it's not you know, for just a duration or something that happens within a school year, but that we're consistent with the process of PBs year in, year out. Sometimes when we go to high schools, you know, I'll say, does anybody remember PBs, or what can you tell me about it? And they stick up their hand and they say, oh, miss, that's that hand that we did once in primary school, right? And I love the hand because it has some great techniques, but sometimes I sort of think, oh, there's so much more to PBs than the hand, you know, and it shows me that they did it in grade 3 and it hasn't continued all the way on. And if it was done consistently and positively, you'd actually realise that protective behaviours is the, you know, it forms the basis for a healthy relationship with ourselves and a healthy relationship with others. So it's really important that it's consistent. So sometimes our education is really structured. So hence the lesson plan. So in this particular lesson, we're going to do such and such. And we do a lot of structured education as well here. The great teaching, of course, comes when we know the process well enough and we use those opportunistic moments when it's just right for that person, just right for that child or that young person that we're working with. And we actually know the process well enough that we can, that it then becomes relevant in that moment, and they're great learning opportunities. And the other way that we educate PBs, of course, is role modelling. So the other side of how we teach protective behaviours is actually how we teach it, right? It's the process, and that's how we practice it. Again, we want to talk about those trauma-informed spaces with that inherent belief that we all have the right to feel safe all of the time. And if you could just take a moment to think about that, we all have the right to feel safe all the time. It rolls off really easy. Yeah, I know the thing. But to actually believe that is very empowering. And for some people, that's actually not always been their truth. It hasn't always been their experience. So that's why we bring in things like the safety sum, the safety continuum. How can we work this out? And even if a child might not believe that they have the right to feel safe all of the time, we must believe it for them. And we can hold that space and say, well, that might not be and particularly, you know, teenagers, they'll often say, oh, no one can tell me what right I have and I don't right to feel safe, and we often get lots of those sort of comments. But we can say, well, I believe that you have the right to feel safe all of the time. And if we can make way to have room for both of those perceptions and both of those concepts, then we're opening their mind to the possibility that yes, everybody does have that right to feel safe all of the time. even if it hasn't been their experience. So our process, as I talked about earlier, should be congruent. It should be congruent with the practice, and we do that. We'll talk a little bit about that through the social and emotional framework. It should be consistent, and our process should also be embedded in everything we do. So we can embed the PB's processes across the whole curriculum. It doesn't have to just relate to those lessons regarding body safety or personal boundaries or personal safety in which we're used to. And when we follow the process, this is what happens. Our client group or the students or whoever it is that we're working with, they actually will develop foundational relationship skills. And that is around, again, their right to feel safe, whether that's in a relationship, relationships with their, in friendship groups, relationships with boyfriends or girlfriends, relationships with parents, relationships with peers, relationships in sporting activities. So it's just a foundational relationship skill that understands that they have the right, and so does the person that they're in a relationship with as well, have the right to feel safe all of the time. The other one is we talk about foundational life skills. So there's a lot of problem solving in PBs. Critical thinking, persistence, regulation, understanding what's going on in our body, strategies to help us stay safe, which not only involve strategies that we can do for ourselves, but also how we can reach out and get help and understanding and support from those networks around us as well. And also about what we want to look for in those support people that help us. You know, what are the qualities and what's really important when we're going to somebody for help, and how our values, so our values alignment within friendships groups, we might look at those. When support networks, we look at the qualities of a network person, and we'll look at those a little bit later. It also means that, so one of the other things that happen when we follow the process is that it's authentic. You know, it becomes real. It's not just, an abstract concept that someone might be learning. And of course, it brings around self-empowerment, self-determination, and also emotional intelligence, because we're asking people to really key into what they're feeling. And a lot of protective behaviours, or every protective behaviour session that we work with, or every time we work with somebody, we actually start with emotional intelligence and emotional literacy. And we do that in many different ways. One of the ways that I've found is really great, particularly if we're working with young people, is with children, is, we use feelings bingos, but we don't actually have any labels on what is the feelings. You can actually download free feelings bingos from our website as well, so it's just there for you. And we can actually talk about what the different expressions might mean for different people, and what I might think of as a grimace, someone else might think of as a laugh. So we're not actually labelling them, we're encouraging children and young people to label those themselves, or for them to interpret the feelings as they see fit. So as a practitioner, if we follow the process, we actually just become more confident with the process. We learn to work from a strengths-based perspective, which is really which really helps to create connection and empathy with our students, which is really important. We lose the fear of PBs, because we realise that it's not just, I've got to teach these to keep a child safe. We actually realise that we're teaching this because this is a self-empowerment process, and we feel great about teaching it, so a lot of that fear goes. There's also a lot of shared understanding. So when we talk about language of safety, which we'll talk a little bit about in a moment, one of the key concepts of that is shared meaning. And so we have shared understanding with our children and young people when we actually really take the time to sit down and listen, to make sure that we're all on the same page, that we have quality in our language, and that we can be, and there's a lot of clarity. It's also empowering for us. One of the things when we do our 2-day practitioner training, one of the things that we often find, and it's actually one of the best comments that I get, that, oh, I came here for work, but now I know how I can how this is going to affect and change my family life, right? So although people come along for PD or professional learning, what they actually walk away with themselves as a practitioner is empowering tools and stuff that they're going to take home. And when they do that and take it home and they learn to embed it, I know that it's going to happen in the school or in the classroom or with their client groups that they're going to work with as well, because it's been an internalized process. And there's also a lot of collaboration. So when we're working with any of our client groups and we work with PBs, because it's such a level playing field, that influencer, there's not a power over. It's actually all just about everybody working together, because we believe we all have the right to feel safe, and we're working together to develop strategies and life skills that is going to help us sort of feel safe at the same time. So it creates that safe space and that collaboration within the classroom and with our peers as well that are trying to do the same thing within their classrooms. So I talked about the internalisation process that comes from being a PB practitioner and how to understand it. So the best way for me to talk about this is, I've got this PowerPoint and I'm going to read it. So the internalisation process comes from understanding the social and emotional framework of protective behaviours and how it helps us to work from a space of inclusiveness and safety that actualises and facilitates our belief that we all have the right to feel safe all the time. And this ensures that our process is congruent with content, and it creates space for feelings of safeness within ourselves and for our students. So I know that's a big sentence. So if I have a look at that, I'm thinking, without the core fundamentals of the social and emotional framework of PBs, which is sort of like the framework in which it all grows from, that is what allows us to work in a space where we can teach the themes, strategies and concepts of protective behaviours to our young people. When we go back to theme 1, which is we all have the right to feel safe all of the time, and we talk about this for our kids in lots of different ways, but the social and emotional framework really helps us to understand and believe in that right to feel safe. I've got a little video here. So the social and emotional framework that we have actually consists of, hold on, let me just go back, consists of 3 things, and that is the language of safety, unwritten rules, and feelings, thoughts and behaviours. Quite often when we see our lesson plans and other things that come for teaching children and young people, this is the bit that's missing, because this is the bit that sort of makes that practitioner practice process so important. So shall I see if I can play the video, Karina? Shall we see if that works? It's just a tiny video about why it's important, and then I'll talk a little bit about the language of safety, if that's okay with everybody. I hope it works. Sometimes when we mention the framework that supports protective behaviours, people are a little confused. Framework? What framework they are? What does it do? The protective behaviours framework is very important. We call it the social and emotional framework, PBs. So the first part of the language of the protective behaviours social and emotional framework is the language of safety. I've just noticed that's not a very good circle there, but that's okay. So the language of safety really is about all forms of communication, and sometimes so the lady that worked with Peg Flandre West, or the lady that developed the language of safety, Di Margetts, who worked alongside Peg Flandre West, who is absolutely amazing. And I still have the privilege of being mentored by her and trained by her. So we would call Di Margetts the expert, but she would not call herself our expert because she says that we're all learning every day. She's definitely the PB elder in Australia and across the UK and the US, so she's pretty awesome. She developed this language of safety, and often we say to her, oh, it could be the communication of safety, and it can, because we're actually using language in all of its forms. So if we remember that all behaviour is a form of communication, and our whole body speaks, not just our words, we can then apply the language of safety to that. The language of safety helps us to create those spaces or those processes of safeness so that we can facilitate everybody's right to feel safe all of the time. We talk about the language of safety in 4 elements. And the first one that we talk about is our quality of our language. And when we talk about quality of language, what we're referring to is our language, exclusive? So is it sexist? Is it ageist? Is it sizist? Is it racist? Is it homophobic? Is it any of these things? So is our language of good quality? And the questions that we can ask ourselves around that, like sometimes, is it commanding? Is it any of those things we want to talk about? Not that command language is bad. Sometimes command language is really important. Sometimes no can be the most important word that we say. It can be a protective interruption as well, stopping things from occurring that might cause safety. So what we're wanting to do in quality of language is ensure that our language is at all times inclusive. Sometimes there can be a tendency to, label or group people, or to group families or sibling groups, or to label certain people in classrooms or in schools. And sometimes those labels go with them throughout life. Or if it's early on, we might be talking in quality of language, that child's always behind, and there's just then an expectation that that child's probably not going to do so well, their sibling didn't do well, or this person didn't do well, without actually being part of looking at how our language affects children and young people, which it does affect them greatly, even if it's not said directly to them. And actually, when we use language that doesn't have high quality or isn't of a good quality, and we might use it about the child within that child's environment, even if that child doesn't hear it, then it still affects the way people treat, react, or interact with that child, which then affects the child's self-concept and self-perception. So there's all that behind it. So if we can be mindful that our language is of high quality at all times, then we're more likely or to be successful in creating an inclusive environment where everybody can thrive and feel safe. The second part of the language of safety, obviously the language of safety is a huge workshop that goes for a day, but the second part of the language of safety is clarity. And this is really just about being clear in what it is that we're saying. And again, I'm going to use the word congruency, which I'm probably used way too many times in this last half an hour. But it's about making sure or ensuring that what we're saying and what we're doing is the same thing. For example, fine, obviously not fine. Or yes, that's okay, or the way that we're talking. So it's really about having, being congruent in our body, our tone, our inflection, and what we're saying. It's really about being authentic and being quite clear in what we're saying. Sometimes when we're talking with children and young people, if I'll go back to clarity, if we say to a child and young person, you know, pull your socks up, right? We might think, for example, someone my age, in their 50s, might know that that means to toe the line, you're misbehaving. But what a young person might actually look down and think, well, I don't really know what you're talking about because I'm not wearing socks, you know. And I've actually had that we've had that happen to one of the young people that we were working with as well. So that brings us into shared meaning. Is what I'm saying the same thing that you're hearing? Sometimes we might talk about things, but someone might pick up another meaning altogether. So with, say, shared meaning. So a classic example that I often use in my training is once I was told by somebody that's very young in my career, that might be what you heard, but that is not what I said. And it took me a long time to realise that actually that was just there's a whole lot of miscommunication there, you know, because if somebody is saying something and somebody is hearing something different, then obviously we don't have shared meaning. So we can always check in and ask for shared meaning. And this becomes important when we're talking with language of safety, particularly when we're talking around protected behaviours, lesson plans and within the classroom, about understanding body autonomy. When we're using, obviously, we're not all using the same names for our body parts. It's hard for children and young people to explain when somebody might not be, when something might have occurred. If they're using names that for their private parts that aren't, penis, vulva, vagina, breasts, bottoms, the rest of it. When they're using other names, that family names or silly names like fluff or whatever, it can be very hard for us to have shared meaning and understanding around what somebody is telling us. And so the one way to check in with shared meaning is when we're teaching, in this particular instance, we're going to teach about the names of body parts because that's anatomically correct, just like a nose is a nose and an arm is an arm. But to check in to say, well, what does that do? Check in, are we understanding each other? What did you hear? And we can practice that throughout everything that we do with children, not just in regards to body parts. So if we change some of our language from, are there any questions, as if that's the end of it, to, so what questions do you have for me now? Then when we're expecting dialogue to come forward, when we're talking with children around shared meaning, we can do that. So tell me what you heard. Just tell it back to me, and what does that mean for you? So it's about just having that shared meaning. It's really handy for adults as well. I don't know, as an adult, if you've ever been into a conversation or a meeting and you're not actually sure what the meeting was about. You've said, yes, you'll do something, but you're not really sure what it is you said you'll do. And there's if we use that shared meaning in this whole language of safety quadrant, we can actually be much clearer in our conversations. The final part of language of safety is about ownership. And this is probably one of my favourites because you might know I can get a little bit tongue-tied. But one of the things about ownership is that we're all human, right? So we all make mistakes. and that's okay, as long as we can own them. And as long as we're open to learning from them, then mistakes is okay. And the same is with our language. So if we get it wrong, it's okay to get it wrong. We can use, we can say, well, just own it. The other thing about ownership is using things like the I statements. So instead of you make me, I feel, you know. So we're not putting our feelings, our thoughts, and our behaviours, giving that responsibility away. We're being responsible for ourselves and taking ownership over those things. One of the other aspects of ownership is we also can have ownership over what we hear instead of just what we say. So if somebody's saying something that another person might find offensive, using ownership, we can say, actually, when you said that, I felt, let me explain why. And we can actually use ownership in that way as well. I don't think I'm going to go any more into the language of safety because it goes for so long, but it's a very good way of creating feelings of safeness and understanding, and creating quality, inclusive, trauma-informed conversations. And it's quite a simple technique to use. Sometimes people might say, well, isn't that just political correctness? And this is, I suppose, where we go back to that internalisation process. So political correctness is usually comes down, control over, comes down, you cannot, you will not, and this is no longer an acceptable way of being. What we are talking about in language of safety is, because that innate belief that we all have the right to feel safe all of the time, and because we want everybody to feel safe all of the time, and we believe that we have a responsibility to that, we actually want to change the way that we talk, the way that we communicate with others, to incorporate all of the language of safety elements, helping everybody to feel safe. Is there any questions around that? Is that clear to everybody? Was I okay? All right, good. I'm going to move on now to the next one, because otherwise I won't get to talk about everything. The other part of the social and emotional framework we talk about is unwritten rules. And unwritten rules can sometimes be like the codes of conduct. They're everywhere. So we all have them, right? They're not legislated. They actually teach us how to be. And so an unwritten rule really is, it comes from the external and it's internalized. So when we're about in our communities, in our schools, in our families, in our churches, in our sporting groups, we learn that there are different ways, or in our different cultural groups, we learn that there are different ways of being. And we might call these codes of conduct, where we sort of slip between different roles into different places in our lives. And so we all have them, and we all bring with us a whole set of unwritten rules. The thing about unwritten rules is, as I said, they're not legislated, but they can be really helpful, right? They can teach us what to expect in certain situations. So when we walk into, for you and I, when we walk into a bank and we're going to the bank teller, we know that if we behave in a certain way or we act in a certain way, we're going to get an appropriate response. If we were to walk in there and say, I'm robbing you, we'd get a completely different response, right? So we understand those codes of conduct about how to behave. They actually can also be harmful, particularly when those unwritten rules might involve things like secrets, what stays at home we don't talk about. They can be harmful when somebody's, feeling unsafe. But the good thing about unwritten rules is they can change over time. So what we've noticed, or what we see particularly, if you look at just gender stereotypes or gender roles, over the last 50 years, we've seen particularly how, they have changed over time. So when my grandmother was was first a mother. She was actually no longer permitted to work in Western Australia because there was the responsibility that she would stay home. So working wasn't something that women do when they had children. That was just an unwritten rule expected in society. Now we're quite capable of having families, children's careers and the rest of it at the same time. So unwritten rules do change and merge over time, but only if we can have the conversations that are going to allow them to change. So PBs actually allows some of those conversations to occur when those unwritten rules might be that we don't talk about the drinking that happens at home or the drug use that happens at home, or we don't talk about some of the things that happen at home. When we open those dialogues, we're actually allowing space for those unwritten rules to be challenged and bringing to the surface, creating a safer space for everybody. So in the classroom, when we think about some of the unwritten rules that might come into the classroom, there's all sorts, right? So if I take from a teacher's perspective, I'm assuming that most teachers are walking into the classroom at the beginning of the school year fully excited. I've got these great group of students. I'm going to teach them. I'm going to teach them this, this, and this. We're going to develop this great cohesive unit, and I'm going to be there for all of them, right? And that's awesome because that's what we want from our teachers, and that's just awesome. But many students may walk in thinking, oh gosh, I hate school, I don't want to be here. And their unwritten rules from their families could be some that school's really important, you've got to be there, you've got to do your best, I'm going to support you 100%. And some people's unwritten rules might be, I'm glad the kids are at school because now I can have the day to myself, and school becomes more of a place where the kids go rather than an experience for the kids to learn and grow and develop from, right? So there's all sorts of unwritten rules that are walking into that classroom with this teacher that's thinking all of these hundreds of things about how great it's going to be. So we've got these children that come with all these unwritten rules around what their expectations and their families' and communities' expectations of what schools are. And the last thing around feelings, thoughts and behaviours in our social emotional framework is feelings, thoughts and behaviours. I'm not going to talk too much to this because I know that I'm probably going to run out of time. But what we talk about here, and the reason it's feelings first, is because PBs is so feelings based. So you remember we talked about feeling safe and recognising our early warning signs and knowing what it is when we are feeling safe and unsafe and what we can do about it. We recognise that young people and children particularly, they probably don't have the emotional literacy or the process to stop the feelings first and to think, oh, what am I thinking? Therefore, what's my brain doing? So I'm going to think that. They're going straight to, particularly those that have experienced some sort of trauma, the back brains kick in and they're going straight to feelings and then to behaviour. And those feelings that are happening in their body, the early warning signs are taking over and their feelings are overwhelming and they go straight to behaviours. And what we say is that feelings are just feelings, so they'll pass, they're not good, they're not bad, they're feelings. Everybody has them. We all have them on this great big spectrum. Some of us have learned to recognise when our feelings are starting to be overwhelmed, and we've learned some co-regulation and some coping strategies with them. Some people have yet to learn those. So feelings are just feelings. They're neither good nor bad. And our behaviour is a reaction or a chosen response that has an effect. And what we can do is we can use our thinking to influence both of these. So I don't have it up here, but we will send you some links to some of those feelings, thoughts and behaviour activities that we use that can really be really good problem solving skills. So we might say something like, if an event was to occur or something was to happen, what was I feeling? Right at that particular time? Well, I was feeling angry. What did I do? I did this. And then we recognise, how do we recognise when we were feeling angry? What could we have done differently that might have had a different outcome? So we can start to talk about our feelings, our thoughts and our behaviours. So all three are affected by, and they have our belief systems, our unwritten rules, and how we interact with others. So those three things, the feelings, thoughts and behaviours, the language of safety and the unwritten rules, they form the basis of the process of being a PB practitioner. So if I try to recap that in a way as possible, we recognise that everybody is coming with a whole set of unwritten rules and influences into their world that may not be the same as ours. And to do that, we have to recognise what our own unwritten rules are and make space for the truth that everybody comes with a set of unwritten rules that may not be congruent with ours. It may not be what we expect. Using the language of safety, we can create spaces of safeness where we can discuss lots of those things as well around the unwritten rules. And we can look at our feelings, our thoughts and our behaviours and how we can use those to influence our interactions in a really positive way. So does that making any sense around what the process and that emotional framework of PB is? And once we have that right, it makes it really easy to have empowering conversations. I don't know if I can just click that. Have empowering conversations where we all have the right to feel safe all of the time. And we can go into teaching a lot of those protective behaviours lessons and strategies that we that we teach within a classroom setting. When we talk about sorry for the time. When we talk about we all have the right to feel safe all of the time, I'm going to go through this really quickly. In PBs, and I'll just do the first theme, what we talk about is personal safety in this aspect. So one of the things we talk about, our body safety. So we want to feel safe in our body. I know you can't see my actions on the screen, but we want to feel safe in our heart. So we want emotional safety. We want to feel good here as well as in our body. And we want to feel good in our head. So we're talking about, feeling safe here. And that's when we're talking about unsafe dialogue, unhelpful thoughts. And we want to feel safe there. So we want to recognise when we're feeling safe or unsafe. And we also talk about feeling safe in our spirit as well. And particularly in some cultures and beliefs and different religions and all of those, feeling safe spiritually can be just as important for our whole mental, physical and emotional well-being at the same time. So we talk about all those aspects of feeling safe. Because what we talk about feeling safe rather than being safe, because actually no one can be told or instructed to feel safe. It's something that has to, that comes from within. So feelings are owned by the person that's experiencing them. But when I was working in child protection, like oftentimes we would know that a child was safe because if we brought them into the office or we've done this or we've done that, or even if a child was sitting outside the principal's office, we know that physically they are safe, but they're possibly not feeling so safe at that particular point in time. So we really want to talk about helping them to feel safe even if these things are happening. I've got a little slide here, but because the other thing that we talk about is we, so who is all of us? We talk about what feeling safe is, and we also talk about what is a right. And this is a really great opportunity or a teaching moment, particularly for in a classroom or classroom projects like the evolution of human rights and where they come from. December the 10th is Human Rights Day, and that's a really good opportunity for kids to get in it. So oftentimes people think, and we talked about that people may not always feel, their experience may not have been that they always have the right to feel safe. They may not have been their truth. And we often talk about this, you still have the right, but what you don't have, what hasn't occurred was that somebody has blocked you from accessing that right to feel safe. But every person has that right to feel safe at all times. And look, just here, I'm just going to quickly go through here, which we can skip this next slide. This is just like tells you that within the evolution of human rights over time. So back from 539 BC, we've been fighting for human rights for all people. That'll be on the slide as well when you get through. So I know that we're running out of time. The second theme, and I can't really talk about everything in this, this 2-day training in 1 hour, but the second theme is that we can talk with someone about anything. And you will have seen that because oftentimes that involves using what we call about the network. And you'll all know the qualities of network person, which is, they have to be somebody that's available to us, somebody that's trustworthy, somebody that believes in us, somebody that's able to help us, and somebody that will listen to us. But one of the things that often isn't there is the importance of the self-determination of the network person. Sometimes not everybody has 5 people, and in an effort to be helpful, we might try to encourage kids or young people to put people on this network. For teenagers, I don't use a hand, I just use a circle, and we just write them down, or we might use phones, or we might use anything. But for young people, the hand is still there. So self-determination is extremely important, because if we're telling somebody who they can put on their network, they no longer own the network. And if they don't own their support networks, then they're not relevant to them. And if a child only has a few, 2, 3 people to put on a network, then that's great. Just use positions vacant until they find somebody that meets those qualities. We can't tell people who to put on the network. We can say at school we have school networks for you. At sporting group we have these networks for you, and we can show them about the kids helpline and the other places that are available for them. They're there, but their personal network has to be determined by themselves. I think I'm going to run out of time, but I'm just going to say that in the middle of the network, oftentimes we put, if children want to put God on their network hand, and some children do, we say pop him in the middle of the palm, and let's put the people that God put in our lives on our fingers. They want to put a dog, they want to put a pet, they want to put a fluffy toy. We often say the same thing, pop them in the middle of our hand, because they're really important. We never want to take away from a child or a young person something that gives them safety, security, or a soothing mechanism in any particular way. So the PB space that we're talking about in the classroom, it assists in constructing positive self-concept, encourages resilience and regulation. It provides safe environments and facilitates safe interactions. And we do that by embedding those 2 themes that we talked about. And I think finally, I'm nearly there, Karina. I think finally, in summary, I'd say the process is important. It's as important as the program. If you understand the process of PBs, you can use anything to be a PB lesson, like turning on the tap. So if you understand the process, you can pick up any lesson plan and do it. It's when we don't understand the process that the lesson plans or anything that we're doing becomes a little bit daunting. It's important to be congruent with the themes in our practice, that the social and emotional framework, which we just glimpsed at today, so that obviously is usually a whole lot of training, provides the foundation to practice PBs every day. And that protective behaviours extends beyond the lesson plan. So we never really got time to talk about early warning signs, but if you can think that sometimes kids feel their early warning signs just being asked to get up and read in a classroom, we can actually use that as an opportunity to say, well, what's going on in your body? How can we self-soothe? And we can get back to it later, and then we can, you can do that tomorrow and use the opportunistic teaching moment later on to help teach some soothing strategies or some coping strategies for that child or young person. And that every interaction can assist someone to feel safe and assist them towards self-empowerment and self-determination, which is how PBs becomes an anti-victimisation and an abuse prevention program. It's from teaching self-empowerment skills and self-determination strategies. And I think that's it. If you want more information, please contact me. I'm really, really sorry about the rocky start. I was really nervous to start with, so I hope you can forgive me with that. And that's it from us.
Thank you so much, Jodie. There's obviously so much to unpack with protected behaviours, and I think you've really gone through the top level very in such a way that it's given us a bit of an insight to how complex it is. But if anyone has any questions, Jodie's email is just there on the screen. You're more than welcome to use this time. We've got about 15 minutes left to put any questions in the chat box or have any comments. You're also welcome to unmute your microphones as well, and we can have a bit of a conversation. And yeah, so we've got about 15 minutes to do that, so please feel free, anyone, if you have any questions. I'll just give you a couple.
Bit of a shame we can't re-record the first bit, Karina.
No, I think you did fantastic, and I'm sure everyone would agree.
I was a bit flustered, so I apologise to everybody.
No, you did a fantastic job. It was really good context to what PB protective behaviours was in the beginning. So thank you. And Marilyn says she was very impressed. So
Thank you.
did have a question come through by email earlier on in this session, and that was to do with PB training and the time frame that it's valid till. So do you have any, for your training, Jodie, do you have a time frame for which you're
So we usually
recommend?
say that if they do the practitioner training, usually we say it's like it's good to have a refresher, like for only a half day or a little bit of a refresher after 3 years or something. But usually it's that's where we go. That's what we go with, and it depends too because when we started PB West. So originally, when I started PBs, I got involved in PBs because of to help keep children safe from child sexual abuse. Then a few and obviously that's was my number one thing. And then a few years later, I got in more involved and met the international body and Time I Gets, and I learned its application across everything. To help everybody feel safe, not just with child sexual abuse, but with everything. And it's sort of mind blowing. So the international standards, I suppose we've only been operating since 2000 and in Australia since 2000 and Western Australia since 2017, 2018. So, if you haven't done training before that, you may have missed a lot of that stuff that we talked about in regards to the process. Yeah, and if you haven't, you might want to get onto that.
I'm just going to leave a link to some further training that PB West is holding in September. I'm just going to pop that in the chat. And we do have a question in the chat from Tracy, who's asking Jodie what your thoughts are on the book Holding Hands, as that's what their school has based their protective behaviours program around.
So that's really an old book, a really old book that when we were with PBWA that they put out, we don't really utilise that so much anymore. Or actually we don't. So I think the Holding Hands book was great when it first came out, and there was a lot of fantastic work that was done in it. The difference is, I suppose, is that it's quite a broad age range. So like the lesson plans go for a difference between 3 or 4 years, and that can be, and I think there's a lot of other things that you can pull in to be able to run something that's a little not so outdated, a little more contemporary that you can find on the things. But it has been a staple around for a long time. Yeah, but it is dated, I think 92, if I'm remembering correctly, or 93 or something like that. I could be wrong there. Please don't quote me on that one.
Tracy's also asked if you have any recommendations on what the school can base their program on, and if you have any thoughts on the education department programs.
So I've seen the education department programs. So I think there's a lot of information in the education department programs that the teachers can sometimes find really overwhelming. And we find that often when people, after they come to the training, it sort of all clicks and it makes it easier for them to pick up some of the education department programs that they're running, because I think you can download them now and they're like 160 pages or something like that. Like, it's just such a lot of work for children and young people, and for teachers, sorry. So there are a lot of really good programs. Can I ask what age group you're looking at, Tracy? Is it primary school or high school?
Tracy says they have year 5 this year.
Okay. So actually, there are some year 5 lesson plans that you can get from our website as well, and there are that are quite good that we've used. So that would be some good ones. And maybe, Tracy, if you send me an email, I can send you a link to some things if that would help. Do you have my email address there?
Yep, so
oh yeah, it's on the screen anyway. Tracy, send me an email and I can definitely help you with those. Yeah.
So we will send through some information about PB West and Jody in the next few days. And we will also send through some resources that Jody might recommend. So if you have any questions about resources, feel free to pop them in the chat. Feel free to send us or Jody an email, and then we can circulate them around to everyone who had registered for the training.
And I talked about some of the worksheets that we use. So, and some of the books and lessons. So we obviously have our own lesson plans and our own workbooks and things like that as well that we find really handy. So I didn't want to be like have ours, but we've got lots of these different resources that we use. So I'll send links to those, and because they're all just downloadables anyway from our website too. And I'll send links to those to you, Karina, so you can send them out to other people.
Okay, fantastic. We do have a couple more minutes. I'll just wait to see if anyone else has any questions or comments, and you can feel free to pop them in the chat. Otherwise, we can probably do a bit of a wrap up. Yeah, just wait a minute or so. I think that might be it for questions, Jody.
Thank you, Karina. Thank you,
No
Tracy,
worries.
Fiona, Lindsay, everybody.
Yeah, so thank you everyone for coming along. That wraps up our session, and we will send through more information later in the week. And yeah, feel free to drop myself a line at any time through the email that I sent out today, or through feel free to get in touch with Jody as well from that info@pbwest.com.au. Great.
Thanks,
Thank you
Karina.
everyone for coming. Bye.
Bye.